my name is Kayla Del Biondo. I'm the Digital Services Librarian at New Canaan Library, and it's my pleasure to have Gil Harel with me here tonight. So without further ado, I know Gil already has a following with New Canaan Library members, but Gil is a musicologist and music theorist whose interests include styles ranging from Western classical repertoire to jazz. Previously, he has served on the faculty at CUNY Baruch College, where he was awarded the prestigious Presidential Excellence Award for Distinguished Teaching, as well as the Southwestern University of Finance and Economics in Chengdu, China. Currently, he teaches at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was presented with the Merit Award for Exemplary Service to the college. At Naugatuck, Dr. Harel conducts the college chorale and a cappella ensemble. He teaches music history and theory and serves as musical director of theater productions. Outside of teaching, he enjoys staying active as a pianist and vocalist. And tonight he's here to talk to us about Renaissance Europe. So Gil, thank you, and take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Kayla, and thank you to everybody who's here. See, we have 80 attendees at the moment, and that's it's wonderful to see that. When we talk about Renaissance music, we are talking about something that, well, quite frankly, is old. It's a style that dates back over 550 years. We really want to go back and talk about the chronological boundaries. So we're talking about something that, on the one hand, is very distant from our own time. And on the other hand, there seems to be something very compelling about this music and something very relevant about it in terms of how it lays the foundation for modern harmony. So if someone were to say to you, well, oh, Renaissance music is so archaic, it's so esoteric, what does that have to do with today? I would suggest that it has an awful lot to do with today and how we think about harmony, how we think about structure and cadences, how these composers articulated keys and tonal centers. And when we get to the end of the program, we're going to look at madrigals, which essentially are almost the pop tunes of the Renaissance. What we're going to see is, I think, something remarkable, which will leave some of us thunderstricken, which is that these madrigals, although stylistically, from a music theory perspective, very different from modern popular music, thematically is tremendously similar. There are an astounding amount of parallels, and we're going to go over that. So again, Renaissance music, very distant, hundreds of years ago, and yet I think it resonates very powerfully with a contemporary listener. And to anybody who is a student of music history and music in general, I think you'll find that this music really, you can trace a breadcrumb trail from the 15th and 16th centuries to the modern period, and even how we talk about singing today, how we talk about music theory today, it all connects to this very important period, and it goes back to the middle of the 15th century. So we're going to roll our sleeves up, you might say, and we're going to get elbow deep in the details momentarily. But let me just say that, you know, if you have a question, I invite you to put it in the chat or in the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll get to it at some point during the program, either at the halfway point where we take a moment to reflect on what we've discussed, or perhaps if it seems to me that it's particularly germane to a point that I'm making contemporaneously, then I'll address it at that time. All right, Renaissance. It's a word we all hear. We've used it so many times. We talk about Renaissance fairs. There are shows, musical theater. There's a show called Something Rotten, opens with a big ensemble number, Welcome to the Renaissance. It's a word that's familiar to us from our studies way back in high school. And yet we might ask ourselves, I think, a very, very obvious question, which is, if Renaissance means rebirth, right? That's what they always teach us. How does that apply to music, right? In other words, if you were an architect in the 15th century and you wanted to, well, conjure the greatness and the style of ancient Rome, for example, well, you could go and study examples of ancient Roman architecture, couldn't you? You could look at the Pantheon, you could look at the Roman Colosseum. You could study, you could take measurements, you could look at materials and learn an awful lot. So there is, in fact, a rebirth, literally, of that style, because it could be studied very closely and then imitated by these students of the style. Similarly, if you were, let's say a poet or a writer, well, you could look back at the works of Homer or Virgil, You could study the prose and the meter and the various details and ingredients that make up the particular style of literature and poetry that we associate with ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But what about music? Would a 15th century musician have had access to music from antiquity, from 2000 or 2500 years ago? The obvious answer is, of course not. There were no music theory treatises the way we think of them today. And therefore, there was really no way to know exactly what that music sounds like. I have to say that even today, we have a very fuzzy, we being musicologists, academics, a very fuzzy and tenuous understanding of music from antiquity. So it's important to keep all these things in mind. The Renaissance means rebirth, but really doesn't apply to music. You just throw that term out the window in its literal definition. It does not apply. There's no rebirth of ancient Roman music. Renaissance music, now we know more about ancient Roman music, and we know that they sound nothing alike. Practically no similarity whatsoever. So while Renaissance painters and architects and poets may have been able to study style from a bygone era, well, musicians could not. So I think that's a very fascinating little detail, a little wrinkle in this story. Now, you notice that I've talked about ancient Greece and Rome, and it must be said that they were tremendously profound influences. The cultures of those particular civilizations were very profound influences on Renaissance thinkers. Well, what about everything that came in between? In other words, the period that we call the Middle Ages or the medieval period. And we're not going to talk about medieval music tonight. If you think Renaissance music is esoteric, you should listen to high medieval music, the music of what they call the ars nova or the ars subtilior in the 13th and 14th centuries. That music, to a modern listener, will sound almost alien. It has almost no resemblance to what we listen to today. It certainly doesn't sound like Mozart. It doesn't sound like Beethoven or Brahms or Wagner or Mahler or Schoenberg for that matter. It is entirely its own thing, you might say. And therefore, it's not something we're going to talk about today. But I think it's interesting to consider where this term Middle Ages or medieval comes from. It comes from an early Renaissance writer, and many of us have heard of him. His name was Petrarch. We know about Petrarch because of his famous sonnets. Now, Petrarch was something on the order of a cultural historian. And I think it's safe to say if you read Petrarch, you get the impression that he has a very favorable opinion of the Romans. Roman Empire, Petrarch writes, represents a sort of an apex, an apogee in the history of human civilization. After all, look at what the Romans created. Palaces of marble and alabaster, paved roads and networks of travel and communication, which were unprecedented in their efficiency. The Romans had pretty good hygiene compared to the average European living in the Middle Ages. So for Petrarch, the Greeks and Romans, the Romans especially, represented this sort of golden age of human civilization. And then with the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, we get this period of darkness and retrogression, this backwardsness. And we've already heard these stereotypes, haven't we, about medieval culture? That medieval people were all dumb and illiterate, and they were incredibly superstitious, and they believed in all the most preposterous dogmatic teachings that one could conjure up as long as it came from the town priest. And we've heard about their terrible hygiene and their mortality rates and average lifespan that was somewhere in the 30s or 40s, depending on the studies that you read. And overall, it paints a very, very dismal, negative picture of the medieval period. It must be said that Petrarch is not really being fair to those who preceded him in the arts and letters of the Middle Ages. Medieval poetry is breathtaking in some ways. If you read, for example, the Epic of Beowulf, or if you look at the Roman de la Rose from France. Architecture in this period, well, it was just in the news last April of 2019. I think it was April when there was that terrible fire in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is just one example of many towering cathedrals, these buildings, some of which are 300-400 feet high, built of stone, built in an era where there is no modern equipment. They're using pulleys and ropes and levers and ways to leverage weight, which are taking advantage of all the physics that they understood back then. And that they were able to build these buildings, which even today are breathtaking to behold. I think it's really important to remember that the artists of the Middle Ages were able to create truly impressive works in literature, in painting. If you look at the works of Giotto, for example, in Italy, if you look at the cathedrals that we mentioned, and certainly if you look at the music, if you look at the works of composers such as, to give you one name, Guillaume de Machaut. So Petrarch, in his scathing depiction of the Middle Ages, is not really being intellectually honest or fair to that period, but it must be said that he had a very inflated opinion of his own time and a very inflated opinion of the Romans. So if you have the Romans here, and then you have what Petrarch sees as the Renaissance here, everything in between is down here, and there we get this term, the Middle Ages. In other words, that which came between or in the middle of two golden eras, golden ages. Things are going to change, culturally speaking, in Renaissance Europe. And before we talk about music, I want to just give you one example of a physical manifestation of how things are changing. We sometimes lump this all under the umbrella of what we call humanism. It's one of the defining features of the Renaissance. We've all heard this term, perhaps, humanism. Sometimes it's intertwined with secularism, so we call it secular humanism. And put simply, humanism is just what it sounds like. It's a belief, a conviction, an ideology which believes that humans are capable of creating beautiful things, and they should partake in the glory of creating those beautiful things. In the Middle Ages, the most frequently encountered composer on the manuscripts, in the codexes of that particular period, which lasts almost 1,000 years, is anonymous. It's nobody, because people didn't take credit for their work in the medieval period. Gloria, Soli Deo Gloria was the catch-all phrase that Bach used hundreds of years later. And we can imagine that it was the mantra of many a medieval composer. Soli Deo Gloria, glory to God alone. And so many medieval composers did not take credit for their works. It would have been considered pompous, supercilious to do so. Why take credit for writing a piece of music or creating a sculpture or a painting, when after all, according to the medieval conviction, you're not responsible for that Gregorian chant or that organum or that painting. God is responsible. God on high, not you. You're just a vessel. You're a conduit. That was the attitude in the Middle Ages. That's going to change in the Renaissance. They start to believe in the beauty of the human body and human creations and the human mind, and that the glory of what God has imbued us with should be shared by all humans. And so we get something like this. The David, or Michelangelo's David, as it's better known. David, of course, a name with a storied history. The David in this sculpture and the David that comes to mind for so many of us is the David of the Old Testament, David of the Hebrew Bible, the David who lived approximately 1000 BCE. And therefore, even for Michelangelo, sculpting this in around 1500 CE was 2,500 years old. And yet, look at this figure. It's about 9 feet tall, chiseled of marble. Some of you have seen it if you've been to Firenze, to Florence. If we zoom in, we see some interesting things about David. Here, David is in the flower of his youth, and notice his features are perfect. He has a full head of hair, thick and wavy. Michelangelo goes through the trouble of giving him the cephalic vein in the right bicep here, indicating that David, with his abdominal muscles and his pectoral muscles and cephalic vein, is in peak physical condition. In other words, this is an elevation of the human body to the absolute highest level. David here is depicted as a sort of flawless man, physically. And this sort of thing would never have been possible in the medieval period. It would not be possible until we have a new ethos, new ideology, new convictions. And again, humanism is a big part of this, the belief that the human entity, whether it's the artist or the hero of antiquity who slayed Goliath in that epic battle between David and the Philistines, whoever it is capable of great things and should be glorified correspondingly. Now we're going to talk about one of the first truly wealthy musicians. There he is. His name was Josquin des Prés. And now we're going to look at a score of his. This is a text, Ave Maria. Now you can see by Josquin's years that he's early Renaissance. And for music history, the Renaissance mostly is dated around 1450, having begun in 1450. I say mostly because there are musicologists who will disagree with these numbers. However, for the most part, they are widely accepted. And if you were open a college-level music history textbook, you would see that Josquin's birth coincides more or less with the beginning of the Renaissance. Now, the text here will tell you something I think quite illuminating about this period. Ave Maria, Hail Mary, gratia plena, full of grace. This is a text which is, in musicological terms, we would call this Mariological, meaning pertaining to or glorifying, surrounding the Virgin Mary, which tells us something very important and reminds us of something very important, which is that at this point in history, 15th century, when we talk about medieval Europe, we have to remember that then, as it would be for centuries afterwards, and perhaps even in the present day, Europe is primarily a Christian continent. Although in some places in Europe that's changing. If you go to Berlin, according to the 2015 or 2014 Berlin census, the most popular religion, as it were, approximately 62% of Berliners identify now as atheists. So at any rate, a far cry from how it was hundreds of years ago, but nonetheless, in the 15th century, Europe is Christian, but more specifically, this is going to be important, Europe is Catholic. Yes, it's true, there were Christians who were considered themselves and were considered by Catholics to be heretical movements, the Cathars, the Waldensians. We won't talk about them so much. It's not really until Luther in 1517 that we really have new denominations of Christianity. So that's going to happen after Josquin, of course, is dead. You can see here Luther is going to nail his 95 Theses to that church door in Württemberg 4 years before Josquin dies. Now, the name Josquin is indicative of another interesting detail, which is that he's not Italian, as we would imagine. So many of these Renaissance figures were Italian. He did work primarily in Italy, but he was Flemish, Franco-Flemish. So he's from what corresponds to modern-day Belgium, more or less. Here we see the style of the Renaissance, and it's a style that's going to be popular throughout the Renaissance and really into the Baroque period. It come up in here and there in works by Brahms and Igor Stravinsky, Arnold Schoenberg, and that is what we call the imitative polyphonic style. What on earth am I talking about? Well, if you look at the score here, and even if you don't read music, this will be something I think you can follow along with. And that is this. The soprano starts, and of course, when we say soprano, we have to remember what that means. Soprano corresponds to the highest voice in the choir. In the Renaissance, it would have probably been, especially in Catholic Italy, starting in the 16th century, and certainly before that, it would have been a female, excuse me, not a female singing, but rather a male castrato singer. Castrato meaning a man who has been castrated. Essentially what would have happened is if a boy who was singing in the church cappella was especially gifted, especially talented, had good intonation, was good at reading score, then that boy's parents would be approached. And in being approached by, let's say a church figure, the choir director perhaps, they would have said that so-and-so is very talented, and if he undergoes this particular procedure, he'll have, the sky will be the limit for him. He'll have it made for life, basically. And so this boy, if the parents acquiesced to the request, the boy would be put in a warm bath, given as much alcohol as he could possibly imbibe until he blacked out, and then a barber surgeon would come in and perform this mutilation to remove the male reproductive organs, specifically the testicles, and the boy's hormonal development would be stunted, and he would retain the high singing voice. So when we listen to most modern recordings, we get female sopranos, fortunately. There are some groups like the Hilliard Ensemble who record with male sopranos, but they're not castrati. They don't sound the same. Do we know what a castrato sounds like? Yes, we do. There is a recording on YouTube of Alessandro Moreschi from 1904. The quality is terrible. It's what my students would call lo-fi, but it exists. All right, Ave Maria, a paean of praise to the Virgin Mary. So the soprano starts with this figure, and the alto enters 2 bars later with the same exact notes down an octave. The tenor answers the alto 2 bars later, exactly at pitch, and the bass enters 2 bars later. You can see G, C, C, D, E, C, and we have the same thing, G, C, C, D, E, C, and repeated all throughout. So it's this interesting musical style where you introduce a subject or a theme or a melody, a tune, if you will, and then you have it imitated at intervals by subsequent vocal entries. Now that's really tough to do. Anybody can come up with a melody, right? That you can play it solo. But the trick with this is that the melodies have to fit in sequence. So polyphonic music, polyphonic meaning many sounds, it's a difficult style of music to write. I think it's a difficult style to perform, although I'm very proud and pleased to say that my students, many of my students at Naugatuck Valley have really embraced polyphonic singing. I have them do it every semester, and there haven't been any rebellions or mutinies yet. In fact, to the contrary, and a real feather in the cap of the students there. I know there's some students listening right now. They're joining us for the program. Kudos to you, because it's hard to sing music where it requires such intricate precision. It really is difficult. One has to be an expert at counting and timing, and to be very confident about what your notes are. We won't listen to the whole thing, but we will listen to the opening measures of this motet by Josquin. And I'm going to go ahead with this. We are sharing computer sound, so let's go ahead and listen. Pause it there. We're not done with this motet yet. Motets were a very popular style in the Renaissance. Now, not everything from the period was sacred in nature. We often talk about this dichotomy between the sacred and the secular. Sacred, of course, being church works, and secular meaning works that were intended for pleasure, or that praise love, nature, perhaps a sovereign. Very popular to praise Queen Elizabeth I in Renaissance England in the late 16th century. We'll talk about Elizabeth later on in the program, but as many of you know, she was queen from 1558 to 1603, 45 years if you can believe it. And as such, there was a ton of music written in her honor. But that would be secular music. This is sacred music. Now, whether you believe in the scriptures or not, whether you're a Christian or Catholic or whatever, I think one feels a sense of crystalline beauty when we listen to this music. It's these interlocking puzzle pieces, almost like a very elegant musical lattice or tapestry. And musicians use a funny term to describe this style. We talk about texture. Okay, so I see we have some questions, and we will get to those questions. I invite you to go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'm going to pause in just a moment when we get to the end of this, and we'll answer. In the next section, rather than embrace the polyphonic style where we have these staggered entrances, that domino effect, if you will, here we have the alto and soprano singing at the same time. Same thing, bass and tenor have a little duet. We call this style the homophonic style because, of course, they have the same rhythm. That's what the prefix homo means, as in homogeneous. Homophonic means same sounding, meaning identical rhythms or close enough to identical. Let's listen to Ave Cuius Conceptio. A beautiful ornament there for the alto. Josquin became enormously popular, so much so that there was something on the order of a bidding war, if you can believe it, between rival factions in Italy, both sacred and secular, who wanted to bring him to their respective courts. Rome, Ferrara, Mantua, all of these figures, whether it's the Pope or the Duke of Mantua, they wanted to bring Josquin to court because his very presence there would be almost an ornament to the court itself. That is to say, he was so famous during his own lifetime that he became something on the order of a celebrity. And again, this ties into that idea with humanism and celebrating human achievement. We see that throughout history ever since, basically, where we almost elevate these composers to the role of deities, as in the case of Beethoven, or sex symbols, as in the case of Franz Liszt or David Bowie, for that matter. Long before there was David Bowie, there was Franz Liszt. If you don't know about Liszt, it'd be a fun summer listening project. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to check the Q&A. Okay, what is the role of the church in the spread of music? Great question. Well, the church was an enormously powerful entity, especially before the Reformation, which we're about to get to. So what we have to imagine is this: the average Renaissance European, Renaissance era European, is receiving a lot of contact and cultural enrichment from two sources. Either they're traders or merchants or people who are traveling and they go into big cities and metropolitan areas, what we would think of now. If you were visiting one of the big ports or big cities where you would do business, banking, trading, etc., then you would have an opportunity to hear music that way. But for the average folks, most Europeans who were living in an agrarian society, music, which was disseminated primarily through the church, was a tremendous, the church played a tremendous role in disseminating that music. So it's a good question. The church has a big role in that. Good question. All right. What I want to talk about now is the Reformation. And we could spend an entire program talking about it, but I have at least two more pieces I want to get to. So let's go ahead and talk about those. First, before we get to it, I really have to talk about the Reformation because it's this seismic event. Seismic meaning it changes the whole landscape of Europe. Basically, it starts with Martin Luther. Although, as I said earlier, there were other dissenters and reformers, but Luther has the biggest impact. Let's talk briefly about why. Well, he's German. He was, in fact, an Augustinian monk. In other words, he was a Catholic monk, folks. Luther did not try to create his own church or create his own religion. And that's a preposterous notion. And it's just it's simply untrue. I see we have a chat. I will get to that chat momentarily. Luther wanted to change, wanted to reform. He wanted to fix problems that he perceived. What were some of those problems? I'll give you a couple you probably heard of, and then I'll give you one you probably haven't heard of. One that you've heard of is the selling of indulgences, which were these little scrolls that you could buy. Now, what would happen was priests who traveled to spread the good word, that's the gospel, would encounter all sorts. And many people, would partake in the practice of confession. They would confess their sins. The priest might, depending on the location, this was not widespread, but it did happen, might offer an indulgence for sale. And the idea was that you could buy this scroll, and this scroll was kind of counter credit against your sins. And you were taught that, of course, sin is inevitable. Everyone who's not named Jesus, according to the teaching, Christian teaching, everyone who's not named Jesus has sinned. Originally, durch Adams Fall ist ganz verderbt. That's a famous Bach chorale. Through the fall of Adam, everyone has become corrupted. Verderben in German, corrupted. So what do? You don't want to burn in hell forever. Well, you could buy these scrolls. And the idea was that the scroll represented merit. And it came from somewhere. It came from something that the church described as the treasure house of merit. The idea was in the apostolic days, in the days of Jesus, the early Christians were so virtuous, they were so full of merit, that when they died, they sort of left their merit in a kind of a bank, a treasure house of merit. And Christians in subsequent generations could have access to that merit if they paid. Now, obviously, this is a very corrupt idea. Luther points attention to it. He calls attention to other practices, which I think most people now agree were not good. For example, there was corruption in the Vatican. There were some popes who were depraved. I think there's probably no other word to describe it other than they were depraved, perverse, licentious, lubricious. Choose your adjective here. There was one pope at the end of the 15th century named Alexander Sextus, and he put the sex in Sextus. He was a Spaniard by the name of Rodrigo Borgia, and if you've heard salacious stories about him, they're probably true. Is it true that he had a special tunnel created so he could bring his paramour into the apostolic palace for sexual encounters? That's true. Is it true that he had children? Yes, he had children. Clearly, they were out of wedlock. The Pope can't be married. So that's an example of corruption and depravity. There were many others, but essentially Luther wanted to change that. And I think it's fair to say that he was successful in doing so primarily due to politics more than anything else. The Catholic Church had alienated some of the German princes, so they decided to back Luther. And basically, in a nutshell, by the middle of the 16th century, the European map is now split. Europe is fractured. There are some countries which have remained Catholic. Italy, of course, remains Catholic. Spain remains staunchly Catholic. But what about England? Well, England is not Catholic by the 1530s. Henry VIII establishes himself as the supreme religious figure in England. In other words, he's higher than the Pope. Why does he do that? Because he wants to get a divorce. It was that simple. He wanted to divorce his Catholic wife. She was a Spaniard as well. She was, in fact, the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. Her name was Catherine d'Aragon, Catherine of Aragon. And the Pope wouldn't give the divorce because for whatever other reasons there may have been, you have to think, Charles V is literally on the continent next door to Italy. So if the Pope grants that divorce, who's he going to irritate? Who's he going to tick off? He's going to tick off the nephew of the divorcee. He doesn't want to do that. So anyway, Henry establishes his own authority, which eventually becomes Anglicanism or the Church of England. In France, you have the Huguenots. They're essentially followers of Luther. Scandinavia becomes primarily Lutheran. Germany obviously is Lutheran, but Austria remains primarily Catholic. Switzerland, depends where you go. In Switzerland, you have those who adhere to Luther, but there are also those who adhere to other Protestant reformers, like Zwingli or John Calvin. Switzerland, being traditionally a neutral territory, had become a haven, a safe place that granted safe harbor to some of the more ardent reformers. There's a lot more to say about this. It's very fascinating, but it's going to give us a nice way to segue into the topic of secular music. Suffice to say that by the 1550s and 60s, there are composers who are writing sacred music, but it's no longer in Latin necessarily, like the Josquin that we listen to. Ave Maria, that text might disappear, because if you're in a Lutheran territory, you're not going to encounter it. Why not? Well, because we know the Lutherans object to what they might have described as the idolatrous elevation of the Virgin Mary, the iconography associated with the Virgin Mary. So a text like Ave Maria, you're not going to encounter that in a German bishopric or principality. And it may not be in Latin anymore. So we'll see, we have two pieces left. One is going to be in Italian and one is going to be in English. So let's look at this, a great example of humanism. If there are children listening, well, there's nothing overtly salacious about this, but there are some sexual innuendos here. So I'll go through the text with you, and then we'll listen to it. And I have to say, I have some of my Naugatuck Valley students to thank for putting this particular madrigal on my radar recently. I wasn't planning on talking about this, but I sang through it recently and thought this would be a wonderful piece to look at. So let's talk about it. Jacques Arcadelt, another Franco-Flemish composer. Il bianco e dolce cigno. Some of you may recognize Cigno here with like the constellation Cygnus, the swan, the white and sweet swan, cantando more, sings as he dies. It's where we get the term swan song from in English. This term, this phrase, this idiom that we use to refer to someone's sort of their sunset ride, their last hurrah is the swan song. So the beautiful white swan sings as he dies. Ed io piangendo, and I weep, giungo al fin del viver mio, as I come to the end of my life. And that repeats. Next phrase at bar 15. Strane diversa sorte. Such strange and diverse, different fates. Che more sconsolato. When he dies, the swan, he's disconsolate, he's so sad. Ed io morò beata. But when I die, I am beata, I'm blessed. And we get this very dramatic cadence to minor key here with the alto on a beautiful suspension there. Okay, so we have this dichotomy, right? When I die and when the swan dies. The swan dies singing disconsolate, but I die weeping, but feeling blessed. Let's find out more. Morte che nel morire. Death, which in dying, m'empie di gioia tutto e di desire, fills me with joy and utter desire. So death, that when I die, it fills me with joy and desire. Now that's odd. What does that mean? Why would dying fill anyone with joy and desire? Doesn't make sense. Let's read on. Se nel morir, if in dying, altro dolor non sento, I don't feel any other pain, di mille morte il di, and that repeats forever, sarei contento, and it ends sarei contento. If in dying, I feel no other pain, I would be content to die 1,000 times. Well, what do you think this is about? Yearning to die 1,000 times? Feeling joy in death? Well, this is, of course, I know some of you are, yes, some of you are thinking it, and you're probably correct. This is what the French call le petit mort, the little death. And I think we need to say no more. Although if anybody wants to know more about that, not quite sure, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll address it later. This is a short one. We'll listen to the whole thing. It's about 2 minutes. And we have a recording here featuring, I believe this is either Hilliard or the King's Singers. Let me just make sure I am sharing long, and there's a lot of meat on the bone there, but I'm just going to point out one little bit of special treatment from the composer. In this last section, we seem to hear this over and over again, right, when he gets to the last line, di mille morte il di, sarei contento, di mille morte il di, sarei, repeats over and over and over and over again. This is a delightful piece of something we're going to see in the next example, and the final example tonight, of what we call text painting, where a composer tries to use the words and the music and the setting to bring out the meaning of whatever they're trying to express or convey or articulate. So here, what does the text say? If death causes no other pain than what I'm feeling now, I would yearn to die 1,000 times and I would be content. So how do you express that, to die 1,000 times? You have the chorus over and over again say, di mille more, di mille. So we have, as listeners, this kind of stereo effect, di mi, di mi, di mi, di mi, di mi, constantly hearing di mille morte di. And then finally with the soprano here hitting that last note, sarei contento, I would be content. And the soprano holding that long note, it's like letting out a long sigh after feeling a sense of utter, absolute contentment. So love this example. It's a great indication of just how racy Renaissance poetry can be, and how Renaissance composers embrace that humanistic idea of celebrating human experiences, including this very universal experience, I think, that is conveyed here. And I won't say any more about that because I don't want this to get too dirty, but I think it's very clear what this is referring to. All right, I'm going to pause the screen share and address the questions now. See a couple. Great question from Bruno Bauer. Terrific question, Bruno. I'm so glad you asked. Okay, going back to the Ave Maria, which we listened to, is it not a fugue? Fantastic question. The answer is no, technically not, and I'll tell you why. Let me share screens, and then I will go ahead and show you exactly why that is. It's a bit technical, but it's nothing we can't understand, and I mean we being everybody on the call. Okay. So, Bruno, great question. Is this not a fugue? And the answer is no. Fugues have a couple of more rules that they have to follow. You would have to state the subject, and then the answer would have to come in at in the dominant key. Here we enter GC, and then every voice is GC, so that everybody's answering at pitch. So this is not a fugue quite yet. They are going to approach fugue writing at the end of the Renaissance, but it's not until the Baroque period that you have fugues with codified rules. There are predecessors to the fugue, what we call the ricercar, but this is not a fugue, although it might sound like a fugue to the untrained ear, or even to a trained ear for that matter. But what we listen for is that every voice starts on G and leaps up a fourth to C. So it's not a fugue. Fugues have to change keys. Hey, this would be great programs. I would love to do programs on the fugues. So if the New Canaan Library wants to indulge in another somewhat esoteric subject, we could definitely have fun listening to fugal music and learning a lot about fugues. All right, let me check for any other chats. Okay, I see we have some comments in chat. I gotta say, folks, 93 people, what a pleasure. And to see so many of my good friends and neighbors and others. We're gonna wrap up soon. I have one more piece I wanna talk about, and I wanna talk about England. Being, for most of us native English speakers, it seems fitting we should at least talk about one English language piece. Hi, Kayla. Kayla, how am I doing on time right now?
Great.
Great.
Take
so
your time. We can go a few minutes over if you need to as well.
Fantastic. Great. I see, I'm just scrolling through chat here, and I could get really carried away with this. I see my good neighbor, one of Darian's finest, Stuart, wonderful. Some family members from New York, some of my students. Hey, Bree. My wife's watching from upstairs. That's an unusual experience. And let me just see if he's here. Yes, I want to just shout out someone very special. Yeah, my brother, Dave, yeah, he's there too, but someone very special, dare I say the most special person in this chat. He was in the ICU for most of March and all of April and some of May. He's now recovering in a rehab facility. He's watching us from his rehab facility. My father-in-law, my hero, Ronnie, we love you. I can't say how special it is to me that you're tuning in for this broadcast. So I don't want to get carried away. I know I'm leaving out a million people. If I didn't mention you by name, I love you all the same. But I just, when I scroll down to the R's to see Ronnie, and it's just so special. Ron Panzak, such a great guy. All right, foreign influence from Gary Banks. Gary, tell me what you mean by that. I see Laddie, Fugue, absolutely, I'm all in. We're going to talk about foreign influence momentarily. If there is a foreign influence for Renaissance composers, ironically, and this is going to sound like a joke, but it's the truth, perhaps the most influential style, regionally speaking, in the Renaissance is the Franco-Flemish style. It's what corresponds to modern-day Belgium. We look at Renaissance music and it seems like one composer after another, incredibly, the best and the most successful, the most popular, the most successful were Flemish. I mentioned Josquin, he was one. We talked about Arkadelt, who we just listened to, another. Heinrich Isaac, who I wanted to talk about, we don't have time. Heinrich Isaac is another Flemish composer. So there were regional influences, and certainly in England, that's going to be a big deal, right? England being the most isolated European entity, being on its own island. There's going to be a tremendous influence here. And the Italian Madrigal is going to catch fire in England. That's going to bring me to our last piece of the day, and that is an English madrigal known by its rather long title of As Vesta Was from Latmos Hill Descending. Let's go ahead and share screens. And make sure sharing computer sound. So here's the madrigal in question. As Vesta Was from Latmos Hill Descending. That sounds like something that Yoda would say, right? With the grammar being in that particular configuration. Let me say a little bit about what's happening in England at the end of the 16th century, which is the end of the Renaissance. Most scholars mark the end of the Renaissance in the year 1600. So just a couple of years before the death of Queen Elizabeth I. England was unique, to say the least. There was a foreign influence there. Composers tended to leave England in their youth, study on the continent, and come back to England to share the skills and talents they had picked up, primarily in Italy, but elsewhere as well. And so the English style that emerges at the end of the 16th century, one of the things that's so remarkable about it is how uniquely English it is. We'll see that in just a few moments. And I point that out because it might be tempting to think of the English as being so influenced by others that they didn't have their own unique style. But that's simply not true. By the end of the 16th century, the English madrigal has become so popular, so successful, that it in turn gets imported to the continent, and continental Europeans are now copying the English. So let's see what the English were doing. Before we do that, a little bit of historical contextualization. We know that England, by the 1530s, is no longer a Catholic country. It's now a Protestant country. It's under Henry. Henry doesn't die until the late 1540s. So under Henry, it's a little bit nebulous. You couldn't be an open Lutheran necessarily in Henry's England, even after the oath of supremacy was a mandatory oath. His sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, was not an open Lutheran. And when she and Henry would have theological debates, it's a well-known story that Henry almost had her put in prison, possibly committed to the Tower and executed for what he thought were heretical beliefs. Nonetheless, after Henry, you get his son. Well, his son was 9 years old. Edward VI was a kid when he came to the throne, and he's going to die at the age of 15. He's mostly controlled by his uncle's side, the Seymours, and they're primarily Lutherans. After he dies, there's a shift. We get Queen Mary I, Henry's daughter by his first wife. And she's, well, her mother was, remember, Catherine of Aragon, a staunch Catholic. And so Mary is going to try to reinstate Catholicism as the dominant denomination of Christianity on the continent. Recall that at this point, after Henry VIII and his son Edward VI, most English people are Protestants. So for Mary, you know, she was quite violent in her reforms, and that's where she gets this famous name, and there's this moniker, which we associate with a particular cocktail, and of course, talking about Bloody Mary. Well, after her reign lasts less than a decade as well. She's going to die in her early 40s, and we get the reign of, yes, I see 2 participants' hand raised. Please, folks, go ahead and put those questions in chat, and I promise I will get to them. All right. After Mary comes Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn. She's in her late 20s when she comes to the throne, and she's going to rule for 45 years. And she was venerated, respected, worshipped almost by some. One of the quirky things about her particular reign is that she never married. So she had probably a romantic relationship with the Earl of Leicester, Robert Dudley, and she entertained suitors from Spain and elsewhere to form political alliances, but never married. So a fascinating figure. She was a very vain woman, apparently, extremely vain, concerned with her looks. And well, who can blame her? I mean, she was a queen after all. One of the quirky details about her vanity is that she, 2 things I'll tell you which you may not know. She was obsessed with having sweet smelling breath. She was apparently lived in mortal terror of having halitosis. And so rather than chew parsley or mint or something like that, she was under the impression that in order to have sweet breath, she should eat sweets. Well, what do you think happened from eating all these cakes and pies and torts and other sugary confections? All of her teeth fell out. Terrible. Another idiosyncrasy of hers was that she had scarring from a bout of smallpox in her youth. And she used makeup to cover it up. Now, the makeup in the late 16th century was made of crushed eggshells mixed with talcum powder mixed with lead. So she was putting lead on her face every day. And it's a miracle that she lived into her, she lived past her 70th birthday. I think she was exactly 70 when she died. Okay. Let's take a look at this madrigal. It praises her. It's a paean of praise to Queen Elizabeth. And it praises her by comparing her to the Roman goddess Diana here with the poetic name Vesta. So no one's actual names are used here. Vesta is Diana the goddess, and Elizabeth is referred to as Oriana. So we have this idea, this image that's depicted. As Vesta was coming down Latmos Hill, in other words, the goddess Diana is coming down the hill, she sees a maiden queen going up the hill. Who's the maiden queen? Well, anybody in England listening knows exactly who that is. There's only one virgin queen, and it's Elizabeth, here called Oriana, not Elizabeth. It's a poetic name. And what happens, in the poem, it says that all the attendants on the goddess Diana are going to leave their goddess. They're going to abandon her, leave her all alone, maroon her, because they're so spellbound by the queen. As Vesta was from Latmos Hill descending, she spied a maiden queen ascending. And then it says that everyone who's attending and paying court to Vesta abandons the goddess to go pay court to the queen. It's really hyperbolic imagery, but that's the point, is it's going to make an impact on a listener. 6 parts. This is one I would love to do it at Naugatuck Valley, but we would have to have a really good group split into 6. As you split into more and more voices, you need more and more confident, independent singers. And I think we have enough. Maybe we'll try it next fall if we're back on campus. All right, I want to talk about text painting. Now, look at this page and tell me what you see. How does the music reinforce the actual text? Well, if you take a look, what you see is, well, descending is a rapidly descending musical line. Descending from C down to C, a full octave descent, actually with a little neighbor tone here. So it's the word descending is set as a rapidly descending line. The word hill is an ascending line with the word hill being on the highest note. And then descending once again, moving down. So this is going to happen throughout the madrigal. We'll listen to it. It's about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes long. We'll listen to the whole thing, and then I'll just show you a couple of cool instances of text painting. Then we'll have some Q&A, and we should wrap up by about 8:10 or 8:15.
First two by two, then 3 by 3, then 3 by 3 together, leaving their goddess all alone. Hasten thither, and mingling with the shepherds of the train, with the shepherds of the train, with sang the shepherds and hymns of Diana, hymns of Diana.
It's important to remember that in the Renaissance, in England, for example, these madrigals were more than just music making. This was an activity that one could engage in that could take place between family members, could take place with neighbors and friends. In some ways, this was taking the place of what we might think of as the modern day Netflix binge. Instead of sitting down on a couch or bed and watching Netflix or some other program, you wanted to have fun recreationally with friends and close neighbors and other social members of your circle, you might get together and sing madrigals. And I could just editorialize from it. I can tell you that it's a wonderful way to forge friendships and get to know people is to sing with them. Some of you, of course, have experience with that. I want to show you a couple of examples on each screenshot. Some obvious examples, you know, Latmos Hill is the high note and then descending, we talked about that. She spied a maiden queen ascending, the music goes up when on the word ascending. If you think about it, if you had notes going down while the singers are actually saying the word ascending, well, that would be contradictory, right? It wouldn't make musical sense to do that. So Weelkes, Thomas Weelkes, the composer here, is setting a high bar. This is a very famous madrigal. It's often used as a paradigmatic example of how to create idiomatically correct text painting. All right, so ascending goes up. Okay. attended on by all the shepherd swain. We get homophonic texture here. Everybody singing at the same time because it's saying all the shepherds are in attendance. To whom Diana's darling came running down a main. In other words, Diana's darlings, her shepherds and nymphs, they abandon her. They don't just casually walk off. They go running towards Queen Elizabeth because she's so beautiful and captivating and enchanting. Came running down a main. Notice the singing, they say, came running down a main. When we sing English, we roll our R's, which singers have to get used to that sometimes because it feels a little bit preposterous. Okay, here's a great example. Let's listen to it.
Down a main, first 2 by 2, first 2 by 2, then 3 by 3, then 3 by 3 together, leaving their goddess all alone.
Did you notice that? First 2 by 2 starts with a duet, then 3 by 3, a trio, then everyone singing together on the word together, and then all alone, lonely, soprano, 1. One last example of text painting before I go over to the questions. Notice the bass line here. In the ending, everyone sings long live fair Oriana. Bam, bam, ba, bam, bam, bam. Long live fair Oriana, long live fair Oriana. Over and over and over again. Practically the last 30% of the madrigal is long live fair Oriana. But notice what the bass does compared to the other voices. So we're looking at the very bottom line. You don't have to be a musician, you don't have to read music. Just look at the bottom line and compare it to the other lines. Did you hear that? So while everybody else is singing these sort of fragmented bursts of long live fair Oriana, the bass is singing these long sustained tones. Now there are names for this. It's a sort of, it's not exactly augmentation, but it's like an augmentation in music where you take a theme and you just stretch it into long notes. But what I love about it is how it connects to the idea of text painting and how, you know, what are they ultimately singing about? They're praising the Queen of England for her long reign, and may she live and rule for an even longer time. And so here's the bass singing these incredibly long notes. Like that, with very, very sustained pitches. And it makes a nice contrast, that backdrop against the upper 5 voices. So a very difficult madrigal to pull off, but we'll see. We'll try it at the college, I think, next semester. Nonetheless, it's a wonderful example of the madrigal, chock full of text painting. And we might think of text painting in some as sort of musical puns. It's supposed to be fun, folks. It's recreational. It's music that's intended to entertain, to divert the senses, and to give the mind something to engage in, some stimulation. So you're not just listening to pretty sounds, but you're listening and trying to sort of put the composer's puzzle together and figure out the hidden meanings. So we started with the motet, which is closely related to the mass setting and the sacred music of the Renaissance. And we talked about the crystalline configuration of polyphonic text in the music of Josquin des Prez. Talked about the dominance of Franco-Flemish composers, including des Prez and Heinrich Isaac and Jacques Arkadelt. We also talked about the Reformation and the change in music, how music is no longer in Latin. It's no longer going to be as complex, perhaps, in Josquin's style. And we talked about the development of the madrigal and the emergence of this vibrant secular music that sometimes is salacious and sexual in nature, as we saw in Il Bianco e Dolcecino, and sometimes here is full-blown in praise of the sovereign, as we see is the case here in this hymn of praise to Queen Elizabeth I. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to get to some questions now. Okay. A little playing of the piano behind you. Unfortunately, Zoom is, and most programs like Skype, Zoom, WebEx, they are engineered with their audio codecs to catch speaking frequencies. So if I were to play it, it would sound terrible because the frequencies that the piano produces don't correspond to the frequencies that the audio codecs of Zoom are meant to pick up. But for Ralph, once we're back on the ground, there'll be plenty of piano. Okay, other than the human voice and the organ, what are the major instruments? Great question, and if we had more time, I would love to talk about instrumental music of the period. The problem with instrumental music, if we're going to start with it, is that when you don't have text to look at, it's sometimes harder to contextualize and to feel connected to the works. But other than the voice and the organ, what are the important musical instruments of the period? I'm going to give you two, and only two. There are others, but I'll give you two, one of which might surprise you, one of which will perhaps be familiar. The one that might surprise you is the recorder. Now, I say it surprises you because we tend to think of the recorder as a sort of rinky-dink instrument made in a Chinese factory, made of PVC plastic, that we give to 8-year-olds, right? Second graders or whatever it is. But in the Renaissance, it was a premier wind instrument. The other instrument that I would mention is the lute, L-U-T-E, which is, sometimes people compare it to a guitar, but they really don't look at all similar. The lute is pear-shaped, but it is a strung instrument with frets held like a guitar, and that would have been a very popular one as well. Yes. Why not use Queen Elizabeth's name instead of Oriana, Claudia? Great question. It was typical in that period to refer to the Queen as a, almost like in the context of a mythological figure. And so they had this poetic moniker or nickname for her, and that was Oriana, sometimes Gloriana. And that's just how she's referred to. And it's not just in this madrigal, it's in one madrigal after another. In fact, there's a collection of madrigals from the period known as the Triumphs of Oriana. And it's just one madrigal after another that praises this queen. It's kind of an interesting idea because none of these composers knew her personally, so how much could they have written about her? I should also point out that the composers often didn't write the text. They waited for a poet to do it, and then they would write it. So the answer, I guess, is to be poetic and to add one extra layer to crack the nut a little bit for the listener. If you were trying to figure out what it's about, you'd have to puzzle out that Oriana was, in fact, the queen. Okay. Yes, that's correct about Zoom audio. What is meant by text painting? Bruno, great question. Text painting is the idea that as a composer, you're going to create music that the musical lines mirror the text that you're setting. Let me give you two examples. What I would call a horizontal text painting and then what I would call vertical text painting. Horizontal would be something like ascending. If the word says ascending, then, and you're setting it as a composer, then you should have an ascending line. And that is, I think, very reasonable and intuitive. The other one would be a vertical set of text paintings. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say you're setting the word pain. What does pain sound like? How would you possibly do that? Well, instead of doing one note to the next, you could do that. You could have a leap of a dissonant interval. But a better way to do pain would be to have, let's say, a soprano on B flat and an alto on A. And that's going to create this crushing dissonance so that anyone listening would hear it and go, ooh, yikes. It will almost create a stabbing sensation in your ear. So you can have harmonies that create text painting, but you can also have lines that horizontally convey text painting. If you were going to set poetry about a bird, you would put it in a high register. Because why would you put text about birds flying around in the bass? You wouldn't do that, right? So that's what text painting is. These are great. Let me jump over to chat. I see a couple of questions in chat. Gary, foreign influence. I think we talked about that a little bit. They did, in fact, adopt practices, and trade and travel is a big part of that. I mentioned that Europeans, in the 16th century, English composers would often travel to the continent for education, and then they would come back. But by the end of the 16th century, English composers are now spreading their style to the continent instead of vice versa. my wonderful dear colleague Joe Farniars in chat. Great, excellent. Well, Joe, I'm going to sign you up to sing next semester. You're going to, hopefully we'll have you join the choir, the chorale, or the chamber choir when we sing some Renaissance madrigals. All right, I see, love, wonderful. Thank you so much for the very humbling comments, Monique and Alex. The most normal thing I've done since March, yeah. Yeah, I think that's something many of us can relate to. Question from, forgive me if I mispronounce it, I would say, Ethel is how I would say it, but Ethel, possibly. Did new instruments affect music composition? Yes, absolutely. One example I would give is instruments such as the viola da gamba. Gamba means legs, and this was almost like a cello, but they didn't have cellos yet. So what did they have? Well, they had this thing that looked like a cello, but believe it or not, it had even more strings. It had 6 or usually 7 strings, typically made from gut, from cat intestines. I'm sorry to you cat lovers, but that's how they made strings for their musical instruments in the Renaissance. They would use sheep gut or cat gut. And what was cool about having this instrument was that it opened up opportunities for the soloist playing the viola da gamba to play really virtuoso stuff. So it's an amazing thing where we have the bass string instrument emerging as this very expressive, occasionally deployed as a solo instrument. So yes, okay, I think I've answered everything in the Q&A. Back to the chat. My neighbor Joel, a great kid. Thank you from Alex. Absolutely. Fugues. Would love to talk about Bach cantatas maybe. That would be a great way to talk about fugues. Perhaps we can coordinate something with the library. And Cindy, thank you. Joel, thank you. I want to thank everybody really for coming out and participating, coming out, for staying in. I'm on autopilot here with my closing remarks, as you can see, but I think it's just very special that we can come together like this. So thank you to the New Canaan Library for offering us an opportunity to virtually come together, and hopefully we'll have more of these programs down the road. Thank you, everybody. As always, I'm impressed with the questions and the enthusiasm. When I talk about Renaissance anything, well, I know 2 things. I know that I like it, but I'm also aware that when talking about something as esoteric as music from half a millennium ago, that not everybody's going to want to know about it or learn about it. So to have nearly 100 people in attendance here tonight is a testament to our very special community. Hats off, folks, and I turn it over to Kayla for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Gil. It was a great crowd and great questions, and we look forward to a future program with you.